As we close out another year of the Municipal Voice, we take a look back at the episodes from 2020 and see how local leaders adapted to an unprecedented year.
We'd like to thank our premier sponsor at Digital Back Office, Palo Alto Networks. Check them out at digitalbackoffice.com or paloaltonetworks.com, as well as our sponsors at Gateway and Housatonic Community Colleges. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or our member municipal leaders.
On our February 12th episode, we spoke with Secretary of State Denise Merrill about the 2020 census, the elections, and the centennial of women's suffrage in America.
Year.
Well, I've been working on 100 years of women's suffrage. I think it's a big deal.
That is a big deal.
Women got the vote only 100 years ago, and it wasn't that long. 1920, the 19th Amendment. My mother remembers when women were first voting, because she was born in 1920, and she remembers as a young girl. It was a very big deal. So we're having a celebration. We have a commission on 100 years of women's suffrage, and we're trying to get all the towns, again, to have a little presence in their town. There were some very interesting women who were from Connecticut who were very involved in the suffrage movement, and so we're trying to...
We might all know?
Oh, yes, of course. Well, Alice Paul, I don't know if everybody knows her name or not, but she was a seminal figure in all this, and she was quite the radical.
If everyone doesn't know her name, they probably should.
They probably should, yes. And of course, everybody knows that Katharine Hepburn's mother, I forget her first name. Anyway, one of the Hepburns was very, very involved in the whole women's suffrage movement. And it didn't stop with the 19th Amendment, honestly. They kept on going, and we're still fighting today for the Equal Rights Amendment. So it's a very interesting story. It was a long struggle, much more difficult and violent than I realized. People really, literally went to prison. One died in prison. They were force-fed when they went on a hunger strike. I mean, this was radical stuff in 1917, which is when this was all happening.
It's not just the old photos you see of ladies in their big kind of bloomy things with cute signs. It was a real struggle.
It was a real struggle. And so I'm hoping people remember that and come out to vote and honor that vote this year.
To come out to vote to honor women's suffrage.
Yep.
Right on. All right.
On our January 15th episode, we spoke with Middletown Mayor Ben Florsheim about his perspective as a Connecticut transplant and why he chose Middletown as a place to settle down.
I think that part of the reason that I got as involved in Middletown as I did is I was trying to sort of establish, like, okay, this is where I'm going to be for at least the next 4 years. Yeah. And I want to make myself a home out of it, and
you did.
One thing led to another. So,
in relation to that, the Hartford Courant recently in an op-ed, you discussed your optimism for the state of Connecticut as a transplant,
right?
And you said after a decade of pessimism, the case for pragmatic optimism was an easy one to make. Why is optimism easy for you as a transplant? You call it a superpower, and how do you get the pessimists among the natives to feel the same way, to be proud of our state?
I think that part of it is just it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, I think the negativity has been a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I think the optimism can be a self-fulfilling prophecy too. I heard from a lot of people who are natives after I wrote that saying, "Thank you. It's good to finally hear somebody saying." Talking about I didn't go into, I didn't like, I had to sort of make a conscious choice given, the space that you get with an op-ed to not go in and say, all right, here's my list of things that I like about Connecticut, because I think that a lot of that people know what that is, and they can also kind of put their own spin on it when they read it. I just wanted to put it into people's minds that there are people who like living here, and that there are people who are excited about this place. And especially in places like Middletown that are growing, that are vibrant.
There's things happening.
There's things going on. There's there's young people coming in. There's people who are moving back to retire, that sort of thing. And I think that that as a transplant, but also I heard from people who had maybe grown up here and lived other places and come back. When you see the other side of it's the grass is always greener argument, right? I mean, it's like when you see the other side of the fence, you're like, maybe it's not always greener.
Yeah.
You know, maybe there's elements of what make us us that are good. And even if we have challenges, even if we have problems, which we certainly do, and I know we're going to talk about them, then they become less sort of existential in nature, less kind of immutable in nature, and more just like, okay, we've got some challenges like everywhere does, and let's get together and figure out how we can solve them to save what's so good.
Yeah.
On our April 8th episode, we spoke with Yale student body president Khalil Green.
So you did an interview with Fox 5 out of DC, and in that interview you said that you wanted to use this position to amplify the voices of underserved communities on campus, especially students of color. How are you going about doing that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely two parts to that answer. The first one is just like general advocacy. So who I'm showing up for and like what things I'm speaking about. For example, 4 days after my election was the shooting of Stephanie Washington and shooting at Paul Witherspoon by a Yale Police Department officer as well as a Hamden Police Department officer. And we protested for literally like 20 hours over the course of 3 days. And that's just the protest. That's not the planning and everything. But I like dedicated a lot of time to that because I think that was something important that I'm not sure.
Some of the protests in Hamden? Or was that?
So there were three. There was two on Yale's campus, and then there was one in Hamden. And I'm sure that there are like others, like small ones too. There's also like the council meeting in Hamden that happened afterwards, but there was a lot of parts to it. So like stuff like that, and then generally like that's advocacy, then the project base. So student government is kind of like consulting, like you're doing projects for the administration. A lot of the projects I've taken on specifically geared towards underserved communities, so like increasing financial aid assistance, like advocating for like the divestment of fossil fuels to help like marginalized communities throughout the world, especially those in regions.
So the divesting, how's that going? Is there movement on that?
So there was a lot of movement. There's a lot of trajectory. Of course, there was the Harvard-Yale protest that went national about that situation. And then this past semester, the Yale College Council officially voted to be in support of it. So we've been had a lot of administrator meetings. There's a lot of momentum. Obviously, a lot of it is kind of slowed down because of this whole like pandemic. We haven't been able to like connect with those certain administrators, but there is movement on the student side still, and there's a lot of hope for change.
You mentioned Harvard. Do you guys coordinate between the student councils of the schools? Do you know
every once in a while? I like know them personally, like not personally because like before they got elected, like after they got elected, I reached out to them. We hit each other up at the Harvard Yale game, so we talk. And then most recently was advocacy around like specific grading policies and changes in light of the pandemic, which I'm sure we're gonna get into later. But that was the last time we really talked to each other collaboratively about policy.
On our May 6th episode, we spoke with Sam Gold, the executive director of the Lower Connecticut River Valley Council of Governments.
As the chair, you've been cooperating with both CCM and the Council of Small Towns on webinars that dive into the legal implications of Governor Lamont's executive orders that he's been issuing during this crisis. How did that partnership come about?
Well, it came about because very early on in March, when the president declared a state of emergency and the governor started issuing EOs and declared a state of emergency, everyone was scrambling to find out what to do. What was the legal advice? How does a town enforce an EO? Well, we all realized we were asking the same legal questions, and it just made sense to come together and act as a team. By guidance with one voice. As opposed to all the different entities, every single town, every single municipal association, every company getting different legal advice. It, first of all, be very expensive. The second of all, we might be giving conflicting advice. So very luckily, Rivercog's attorney happened to also be doing work with CCM, and luckily the legal community in Connecticut is relatively small. They all know each other. So whether whether it be CCM or Cost or CT Cogs, we all know each other. So but we're not strangers to working together. And in this situation, it was an obvious fit.
It just made so much sense.
Let's get everyone's lawyers talking to one another. We'll take turns and we'll figure out unified guidance. And
on our May 19th episode, we spoke with attorney Steve Mednick about how he helps municipalities rewrite and interpret their charters.
But New Haven has a charter, correct?
Oh, New Haven has a charter.
How far does it go back? Is it this one of the things that was set up, with
most of the charters in the big cities go back to the 19th century. Okay. And in fact, that's always one of the challenges for the big city charters. When you look at the Hartford Charter, the New Charter, the Waterbury Charter, New Haven Charter, Bridgeport Charter, you will see a very dense document. It's 400 pages long. Each of them are at least 100 pages long. And those charters are very complicated because you still have provisions that were granted by the General Assembly. So in the recent, the current public health crisis, you'll see some mayors from the bigger cities issuing executive orders to do things. And I've had mayors and first selectmen from smaller towns say, I'd like to do what the mayor of New Haven or the mayor of Hartford just did. And said, well, you can't.
Because it's not in the charter.
And it's because their charter had a provision that was granted by the General Assembly in the 19th century or the 20th century that gave that mayor specific authority to do some
so with some of the older charters, they actually got grandfathered in on some.
They grandfathered in the old special acts.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
So you can't get that type of charter anymore.
You can't. I mean, I think if you have friends in the legislature, you might try to get one to give you unique powers. And some of the powers are quite interesting. The city of New Britain has the authority to create a militia to protect its boundaries.
So don't get Aaron Stewart mad with you.
Don't get Aaron Stewart mad at you. She also has the ability of eminent domain in the town of Cromwell because they own a reservoir there. Mayor O'Leary has the ability to deputize water police to police Bantam Lake because Bantam Lake is a water source for Waterbury.
Okay. And even though it's not actually in Waterbury.
Not in Waterbury.
On August 26th, we were joined by Leon Andrews, the director of the Race, Equity, and Leadership Initiative at the National League of Cities. He spoke about what equity really means and what role our towns and cities can take in this equation.
So how would you define some basic terms like equity and equality and racism and structural racism? And why is it important to differentiate between some of those terms?
Yeah, but those are really important, pertinent terms to define, and we'll try to jump into it. I mean, I think the equity and equality piece is one that I think is so important to understand at kind of as a foundational level. People tend to use those words interchangeably, and they're not
really not. Yeah,
they're not the same. Yeah. So, when I think about equity versus equality, the equity, just at a very high level, equality means the same, giving everyone the same. Yeah. Equity means fair, giving people what they need. And so there's a lot of questions of, well, does everyone need the same thing when we are talking about equity, when we're talking about the work that needs to happen in local government? And so there's this wonderful image. I'm not sure your audience has seen it. If you've been in this space, there's like 3 people behind a fence trying to watch a game. And you give them all the same thing as they're trying to watch the game from behind the fence. Yeah. But they all don't need the same thing to watch the game from behind the fence. So equality is giving them all the same thing. Equity is asking, what do they need to watch the game from the fence? And
so the short kid needs a taller box.
Yeah. So someone is in a wheelchair and needs a ramp, right? Yeah. And so it's like, how do you think differently about just understanding the differences between the two? But while it's important to understand it at that level, it's really simple, Matt, to kind of talk about that level. I also want people to know equity is much more complicated than that, right? So it's important if people don't use the words interchangeably, equality and equity. But when you start talking about equity in that same diagram of those 3 people behind the fence, the question will be, why are they behind the fence? How come they're not in the stands? How come they're not playing in the game? How come they don't own the team, right? There are lots of kind of equity questions that we really want people, as you start to understand equity, to understand it's more complicated than just 3 people behind the fence trying to watch the game. But and at a very foundational level, what I do hope is that people do walk away realizing that equity and equality are 2 separate words, right? And I think that I think is really important. And then you asked about racism
versus structural
and institutional racism, and that's a really a really important term to really unpack. The way we talk about racism for city leaders is to understand it from a policy perspective, policies, practices, procedures. And most of the time, people tend to think of racism as individual acts of racism. So Dylan Roof, everyone remembers Dylan Roof in Charleston 6 years ago, walks into a church and murders 9 people.
and that was an individual racist act, or Charlottesville 3 years ago, right? In terms of what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so that's usually how people begin to process racism in the individual act. But when you ask about institutional racism is actually looking at policies, practices, procedures that have actually benefited white people over people of color, sometimes intentionally or inadvertently, but sometimes actually very intentionally.
Yeah.
So, for instance, when you say policies, practices, procedures that have benefited white people over communities of color, one thing that we bring up in our trainings a lot for city leaders is to talk about redlining. And so there's a lot of local leaders have heard of redlining before, but not really truly understood the impact of redlining. And as we looked at redlining, knowing that there was intentional policy that was created after World War II, that created opportunities for predominantly white families to be able to move out into the suburbs and created the suburbs. 98% of all loans that were granted to families that were returning from the war were given to white families to be able to get access to where they generated wealth. And so that talking about that one policy is institutional racism. So so acknowledging that redlining happened, but redlining is not the only thing that has happened. Right? If we look at our transportation policies, we look at our education policies, we look at our criminal justice system, as we look at all of our governmental institutions, policies, practices, and procedures have been designed to benefit white people over people of color. And that is what structural racism is. So structural racism is acknowledging that it's happened beyond just one institution. It has happened beyond just our housing or just education. It's in all of our institutions, which is what structural racism is.
On July 29th, we spoke with New Haven Mayor Justin Alliker.
The other issue that has come to the fore kind of this year nationally is inequities based on race, meaning particular outcomes in housing, policing, and even representation judged by the color of your skin. New Haven has called racism a public health crisis, along with several other towns and cities. Can you tell us what that means to New Haven?
Yeah, I think COVID has exposed, in particular, a lot of issues around the inequities that many of us that have lived in New Haven for a long time have known for years, and specific to the health issues associated with systemic racism and inequities. People of color have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. There's many more cases. The cases are more severe. And that's an indication of a lot of the inequalities. That's an indication that people of color don't have access to appropriate health care. A lot of people have a higher propensity for comorbidities, but it's also an indication that many people of color don't have the ability to telework because oftentimes people are working on the front lines and don't have the option to opt out to exposing themselves to other people. And that's just one indication of a lot of the systemic challenges that exist in our cities, around our nation, around racism. We've talked a lot about police brutality and the challenges that communities of color have experienced with the relationship with the police. And there's been a lot of work done in the last several weeks on that. And my administration is actually working on some things to address issues around, in particular, the relationship between the police and the community, and this struggling really deeply with this question about how to keep communities safe, which doesn't always mean having more police or having the police involved at all. But in addition to that, I think there's a real economic question here. I've come out and supported the idea of a segregation tax because Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the nation. And because suburban communities put up barriers to access to affordable housing developments, it means that so many people don't have the option to integrate into other towns. And towns very proactively prevent that kind of integration. And I think that either towns can and should support increased options for affordable housing, or they should pay a tax so that places like New Haven that have upwards of 30% affordable housing have the kind of economic support that we need to make sure that our residents have the resources they need to get out of poverty.
Yeah. You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH LP 103.5 FM.
On the July 15th episode, we sat down with West Haven Mayor Nancy Rossi to discuss her vision for her city's financial future.
West Haven is in the unique position of being part of the Municipal Accountability Review Board, or MARB, as we shorten it, which was set in motion before you assumed office. Through your leadership and partnering with the MARB board, West Haven finances are undoubtedly getting better, but it hasn't always been a smooth ride. How has it been to collaborate with a board that sits outside of city leadership?
I have to say it's gotten better. It's not as difficult as it was in the beginning because I'm only in office one day. I'd taken the oath of office on the Sunday, and on the Monday, I got a call and was summoned to Hartford on Tuesday and was handed the letter that, okay, you're under the review board. So we've done our best. We've also had a lot of members change on it too, with the change of, governor and all of that. But we have done our best, and I do believe that we have made major improvements. Our outlook for our bond rating was raised for, probably about a year ago now, and we're moving along, and our financial position has improved. We have a fund balance, no longer have a deficit in our general. Keep that moving. That's very, very important, so that we have some sort of rainy day fund as opposed to having a deficit, which means you have absolutely nowhere to go. So we're going to keep going along. My goal is, hopefully, before I leave office, whenever that is that we are able to have the requirements to have MARB be able to release us from their jurisdiction. And that is 3 balanced budgets and no longer relying on state aid, which is a goal of ours. And we that phased out in 22. So I'm very, very hopeful, as much as, they've been very helpful in a lot of ways. And obviously the restructuring funds have been very, very helpful. It's very hard sometimes for myself and others in my administration to lead when you always have to be checking with them on certain things, contracts, $50,000. So I don't have the free will that other mayors might have had.
But you may in the future.
Yes, I'm very, very hopeful in the future I will.
You have hit 3 years of a balanced budget and no longer be taking the state aid, and then you're free again.
And we're free.
On our October 14th episode, we sat down to talk about cybersecurity with Henry Dashowitz, Chief Finance Officer, and Karen Delvecchio, IT Director for the City of Norwalk, and Dale Bruckhart, VP of Marketing for Digital Back Office.
Karen, just back to you for a second. How has kind of your role changed in the last year?
Well, COVID-19 certainly has changed the way that we do business. It has really changed how we envision delivering services. It's no longer a case of the expectation is the resident or the business owner comes to City Hall to engage in some type of transaction. Pushing our employees to work from home really was a paradigm shift, I think, in government. No one has ever heard of the term government from home before. It's work from home, but not necessarily government from home. So this was really a gigantic change for everyone. And it presents for IT some unique challenges in that now the workforce is remote, and do you have the infrastructure in place and the privacy and security infrastructure to go with that in place to protect the information that's getting passed back and forth now between a remote worker and wherever your cloud-based applications or servers happen to be? And have you trained your workforce to be able to recognize when they're working from home what different types of security or malware or phishing attempts they could be faced with? I mean, with COVID-19, we've seen all kinds of phishing attempts that look very real, that look very official, but in reality, they're not. So that has been really a huge challenge, I think, for every IT department, whether you're in the private sector or in the public sector, but especially for the public sector. primarily our folks work in City Hall, or they work at the police department, or they work at the library. They're not work from home workers, and that has been an enormous change. The training, the infrastructure, the security, multi-layered approach that has to take place.
How many individuals were we talking about roughly that you needed to set up to work from home rather quickly?
Oh, it was hundreds.
Hundreds. Okay, so
hundreds.
It was a big task.
It was a big task with very little notice. So the decision was made, and I think there was, 72 hours of, okay, this is what we're going to do in response to COVID-19. And, at the time, no one really had an estimate of how long this was going to take place. Do you activate your 2-week hurricane plan where your offices are closed for a week or 2 weeks? That's pretty much what we were going from. No one imagined that 7 months later, we would still have most of our workforce working remotely.
Yeah, I thought it'd be out for a couple of weeks tops.
Exactly.
I would add, if I could, when COVID hit and we had to work from home, the primary focus of everyone was, how do we get up and running? How do we do this? How do we mobilize? Cybersecurity is an afterthought. It's not an afterthought to Karen and me, but it's an afterthought to getting up and running. So there's a vulnerability in trying to get people's awareness when their whole work life is changing is hard, just to get them their attention and to focus on the issues.
On our November 25th episode, Margaret Middleton, the new CEO of Columbus House, sat down and talked with us about the successes and the work still needed to be done in ending homelessness in Connecticut.
Can you talk about the 2016 effort by then Governor Malloy, and you were part of this, to end chronic veteran homelessness, which led to the figures that we just mentioned, that those 200 that we still have are mostly sheltered?
Sure. I love to talk about that, Matt, because to me, it's an example of the idea that as a community, when we put our will and our government effort behind an idea, we are totally capable of actually solving problems. I think a lot of people think of homelessness as being this like intractable thing, and that it's sort of inherently an individual problem, that people have mental illness or they have substance abuse problems. And the effort to end veteran homelessness really shows that, like, nope, it's really about resources, coordination, and the will to solve the problem. And the VA was really a very essential part of that. The secretary of the VA at that time put a huge priority on veteran homelessness. And the federal government just put a ton of money into what are called vouchers. If you're familiar with vouchers, Matt, these are essentially rental assistance that people can take to rent an apartment, the veterans can take to rent an apartment. And we have an awesome federal delegation, as you know, and Connecticut was really, really smart and coordinated in the way it used those vouchers to get chronically homeless veterans housed, to get female veterans housed, and to get veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan housed. And so by doing that, they reached what this thing called functional zero, which is a sort of technical definition. I think there's only one other state that was sort of honored in that way, and recognized for having achieved that. So it's really something to be proud of. And I think we should all just like hold on to it as an example of like, we actually know how to do this. We totally know how to do this. We could end homelessness for everyone, for sure. We definitely could do it. We just have to have the political will. Honestly, we have to put our resources into it, and we have to care about housing.
It's not insurmountable. It's not just that's the way it's always been and always has to be. There are answers. And it sounds like also from what you said that a lot of what Connecticut did, those resources from the federal government were available to everybody. And what Connecticut did was figure out how to utilize them better in a lot of ways. Was
well,
the crux of a lot of that success?
I mean, part of it is that Connecticut has a small enough homeless population that through really, really awesome outreach and engagement efforts on the part of the homeless services provider community and also the VA, they were really able to get a handle on how many homeless veterans are there, where are they, and really do targeted outreach and engagement work to get people housed. So it's really, it has to do also with the fact that Connecticut is both small and very capable. Like, it's just full of awesome, hardworking organizations that really put a premium on working together.
On our September 30th episode, we sat down with Jamie Stevenson, the first selectman of Darien, to discuss challenges like education in the age of COVID.
So recently you tweeted out support of an op-ed in the New York Times about the need to improve on digital learning. But Well, you also said that kids should no longer be bound by city-town boundaries to succeed educationally. I think it kind of ties into the equity stuff you're talking about. Do you see these digital tools that make up our education as part of the COVID curriculum? Do you see them continuing afterwards? And
oh gosh, I hope so. I think this is one of the real exciting opportunities that has been fast-tracked, I'll say. It's been around. There have been a lot of initiatives with online learning. I can think of the Khan Academy and a bunch of different other initiatives. But, we had to immediately figure out how to deliver education in a digital platform.
Yeah.
We've spent a lot of time in the state of Connecticut with my colleagues on CCM talking about how to fix the education gap between certain municipalities. And we always talk about money, and we talk about housing and things like that.
Yeah.
When we have these tools right at our fingertips that literally should be able to erase the boundaries, any artificial geographic boundaries with education, and put every child in the presence of great teachers.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think that is an exciting opportunity. I know that our governor is passionate about using technology in great ways, and I'm hoping, I'm not part of his circle, but I am really hoping that he sees the great opportunity here so that every child has the opportunity to have great teachers regardless of where they live.
Yeah. Thanks to our premier sponsors, Digital Back Office Palo Alto Networks, who you can check out at digitalbackoffice.com and paloaltonetworks.com, as well as our sponsors, Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. Learn more at gatewayct.edu and housatonic.edu. Thanks to CCM staff, and an extra special thanks to Paul Bass and Harry Draws for keeping the show on the air through uncertain times. Make sure you support the New Haven Independent and WNHH where you can. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry Draws on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.